2022 has come and gone, and personally it didn't feel like a particularly massive year for the video game industry, partly because we finally felt the consequences of the pandemic pushing numerous games further into the future. It's not particularly surprising, as some people who actually work in game development said early on, closer to when the pandemic started, that games that were already in the later phases of production would still see their releases through from 2020 to 2021. But games aiming for 2022 or beyond might be the ones suffering the biggest delays. That prediction seems to have come true, at least a little bit, especially on the AAA gaming front, because it feels like the indie and AA sectors did most of the heavy lifting throughout 2022. You'll understand why I feel this way soon. Of course, that's not to say good AAA games didn't come out last year. They absolutely did. And what's more is that we're finally starting to see the semiconductor situation finally begin to resolve itself as more consoles and GPUs are becoming readily available again to people who aren't aggressive scalpers. PlayStation 5s are especially a surprise, because I've seen people express shock at fully stocked displays at their local stores. Now granted, that's probably not the case everywhere, but it's an improvement over how things were the year before. But now we're a few months into 2023 and I'm finally ready to go over my top 5 games of last year. Now some of you who haven't seen my previous year lists might be wondering, why do these so far into the next year? And the simple reason is, I typically need a few extra months to play catch up and try out games that I'm interested in, especially if I feel that they do have a good shot at making it onto the list. But beyond that, another thing that should probably be clarified is, I'm just one guy running this channel. I have a full-time job already, which leaves me with enough income to buy more games, but less time to play them. The adult gamer's conundrum, which I'm sure a lot of you can sympathize. And because of this, I have to pick and choose really carefully what games I play. I have to prioritize what I think I'll love the most, and put the others for later, while some might never be touched at all. This means there's a lot of games I won't be talking about in this video, and some of them might be titles you would normally expect from a person making a top games list for 2022. Overall, I'd say most of the games I played through 2022 were quite good. I'm glad to say I experienced very few disappointments, and because of this, it was a bit of a challenge making the final 5 list. But don't worry, like always, I still have shoutouts to give in the form of honorable mentions. These are the games that didn't make it onto the list, but I enjoyed well enough that they're worth bringing up here. These titles are in no particular order unless stated otherwise. First is Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. The definition of remaster continues to blur even more, but thankfully it's for good reason, because Crisis Core Reunion has pushed the boundaries of remastering by offering an incredible graphical leap combined with almost innumerable quality of life changes and additions, and even some cool new battle mechanics. The story of Zack Fair, one of the most important figures in the Final Fantasy VII canon, is reinvigorated with this exceptional re-release that finally cuts the shackles that were tying the original game down to Sony's 19-year-old handheld, the PSP. If you're a new fan of FF7 or an old one who would like to re-experience the magic and emotion of Zack's tale, then Reunion is the best thing you could have asked for. Granted, it could also be considered heavy spoilers for those who have played Remake but not the original game, but I think the development team was aware of that and decided to take that risk anyway. Reunion will either sate your hunger during the wait for the upcoming Rebirth, or make it even worse. Either way, it's a great updated experience that brings this 16-year-old gem to the modern age. Next is The King of Fighters 15. The true originator of team-based fighting games returned earlier in the year, and what an incredible return it was. Featuring a cast of characters old and new, a significantly improved visual presentation, and the implementation of the passionately requested rollback netcode, KOF 15 represents a new peak in the series that shattered all expectations. The characters in this game feel like the best versions of themselves, and yet that doesn't make the game harder to get into. In fact, it's probably the most accessible the series has ever been. The idea of jumping into a fighting game where you have to learn a minimum of 3 characters may seem like a gargantuan task, but don't mistake the game's uniqueness for difficulty. KOF 15 is actually quite welcoming, and it's loaded with great content. Some fighting games in the past 7 years or so have sacrificed either their depth or their identity in order to chase a broader audience, but KOF 15 manages to dodge that trade-off. It maintains the KOF spirit and opens its doors to new players while still feeling complex at a higher level. If you've ever been interested in this series, now is the time to hop on. The third honorable mention goes to Mount & Blade 2, Bannerlord. After a long wait followed by a long period in early access, Bannerlord finally received its version 1.0 release in 2022 on PC and consoles. As a true blue sandbox game, it offers an incredible amount of freedom to the player. You can choose your lineage and backstory, then once the prologue is complete, you begin your journey to setting up your own kingdom in any way you deem necessary or fitting for your character. Hire mercenaries, raid villages, manipulate nobles, marry into wealth, and engage in big battles with hundreds of participants. Whatever you can think of, the game probably allows it. There's a gigantic map of towns, cities, and castles, and many military units exclusive to different cultures. It's a real, honest-to-goodness, create-your-own-adventure type of experience. It's not a perfect game, of course, with its fair share of bugs, AI problems, and missing features and systems that appeared in Mount & Blade Warband, but the overall package, as it is now, is still a very fun and open-ended game with a ton of stuff to do. Our fourth honorable mention is Metal Hellsinger. Rhythm games have experienced massive resurgence in the last several years, and now they're starting to fuse with more genres to create truly unique and clever experiences. One of those genres is first-person shooters, and while Metal Hellsinger is not the first one, it definitely sets a new standard to reach or beat for any team looking to make their own. Featuring fast-paced gameplay, cool weapons and bosses, and an ass-kicking soundtrack composed by Two Feathers with appearances from vocalists like Serge Tankian from System of a Down, Matt Heafy from Trivium, Randy Blythe from Lamb of God, and other incredible talents, this is an action-packed game worth slaughtering demons to. It has the gameplay, the aesthetic, and the tunes. Even if you're a fan of only shooters, or only rhythm games, or only music, this is a game to check out anyway. Now, my fifth and final honorable mention is the only one I'll give a placement to by saying that if this list were top 6 instead of top 5, then it would have made it to number 6. And that game is Proteus. There's been a massive boomer shooter boom happening in the last few years, stuffed to the brim with awesome games that take inspiration from classic FPS titles like Quake, Wolfenstein, and Doom, combining a late 90s or early 2000s visual presentation with modern gameplay and speed. Proteus is one of these games, and man does it fire on all cylinders. It's as if Brutal Doom and Halo had a baby. It's a total package retro throwback with a vibrant sci-fi setting, super crisp and satisfying sound design, buckets of demon gore to swim through, excellent level design, and a fast, involving pace. And I haven't even mentioned yet the fact that the game also features a remarkably in-depth level editor and a ton of community-made maps to bolster your experience, as well as multiplayer in both PvP and co-op forms. Proteus looks, sounds, and feels absolutely incredible, and is a must-play for fans of old shooters, specifically Doom. If that's you, then do yourself a favor and pick it up. This concludes my honorable mentions, all great games in their own rights and potential Game of the Year quality titles for other people, but unfortunately still beaten out by 5 others I simply enjoyed even more. So, without any more stalling, let's finally dive into my top 5 games of 2022. Number 5. Sifu. I was always excited for Sifu, but even I couldn't have imagined how much I would end up liking it. Coming somewhat fresh off their previous game, Absolver, developer Slowclap wanted to continue their journey in crafting attractive and fulfilling hand-to-hand combat, ultimately landing them at this stylish tale of revenge inspired by classic martial arts films. After an incredible tone-setting opening sequence where the player temporarily controls the main antagonist, we choose the sex of our character and begin to tear through 5 very different levels to reach 5 different bosses with their own unique themes and presentation. But the main attraction here is hard-hitting kung fu action, and Sifu has a very investing combat system that seems simple on the surface but requires lots of practice to truly use effectively. Easy to learn, difficult to master. Using a mixture of light attacks, heavy attacks, and even analog stick motion inputs, not unlike some character action games, Sifu offers up a very dynamic form of video game martial arts that makes it feel as though you're not always sticking to the same exact script for every single fight like other games do. With a large arsenal of moves and weapons to achieve victory, no fight ends up being the same, even the ones you do over and over again. Focus attacks exist that typically open up a window for more aggression. You can sweep or knock enemies down for some free punches, you can daze them or push them back either into a wall for an extra moment of stun or off small heights for damage. There's also a lot of defensive options for the player to take advantage of, including tightly timed parries, a dodge that puts distance between yourself and the opponent, and a standing weave that lets you plant your feet so you can immediately punish your foe's whiffs with quick retaliation. Sifu feels like it has a ton of ways to allow the player to express themselves and get through a stage with a preferred manner of offense. A fascinating idea the game has is the aging mechanic, which is the game's unique way of going about permadeath. When you die, your age goes up by 1, as does your death counter. If you die again, your age goes up by 2, then by 3, then 4, etc. The amount of years you age is additive per death, and the only way for that number to go down is by defeating certain tougher enemies scattered throughout a stage, denoted by their aura. For every 10 years you age, your damage goes up a little, but your maximum health also drops a little. Once you hit age 70 or above, you've run out of extra chances. You die again, then you die for real. It's a system that encourages the player to master the combat as best they can, because the younger you end one stage, the younger you begin the next, and that could be crucial to surviving. But one thing that really pushed Sifu into the top 5 was Slowclap's continued support for the game as the months went on. If you saw my review, which was made soon after the game came out, one of the bigger criticisms I had was the training room. It was lackluster in features to the point where it was almost useless for anything more than learning the basics. But thanks to Slowclap's persistent dedication to making the best game they could, they eventually expanded it to make it much more robust by letting you choose the enemy type you're fighting against so you could get worthwhile practice in, including bosses. But it doesn't stop there. They also added costumes to reward loyal players, and an easier and harder difficulty, and cheats and modifiers to allow players to make the game even easier or harder. You can burn through levels and thrash enemies like a wrecking ball, or tread carefully knowing a single hit could end you. It's all up to you. The upcoming Arenas expansion will add even more to the game with a challenge-style mode with new locations and hours of content. Sifu is a great game that gradually became greater, and it makes me eager to see what Slowclap has planned once the time comes to move on to a totally new project. Number 4. Signalis. The world of survival horror features a giant chasm separating the resources available for some of the best games in the genre. They're either AAA blockbusters like the remakes for Resident Evil 2 and Dead Space, or indie throwbacks like Tormented Souls and Nightmare of Decay. However, when the stars align and great minds breathe life into their ideas, an indie game that's more than just a grasp at nostalgia emerges to become one of the all-time greats. Enter Signalis, a classic-feeling survival horror experience set in a dystopic far future, created by a team of 2 artists and game designers based in Hamburg, Germany. Unlike some of its indie peers, Signalis is a pure genre game that doesn't tie its entire identity to 1 or 2 hits of the past. It's a stylish and mechanically sound amalgam of many sources of inspiration. Taking place in a far future of interplanetary space travel and advanced colonization technology, Signalis' narrative background is that of a totalitarian nation called Yusen, which is warring against the larger empire it broke away from. The nation of Yusen currently inhabits an unnamed planetary system, and the bulk of its labor force and military are made up of replicas, androids that run on copied human neural imprints which give them very human desires that will destabilize them if left ignored. These replicas are commanded by actual humans named gestalts. Visually, the game uses a striking low-poly 3D art direction that's reminiscent of PlayStation 1 era graphics, plus sci-fi and cyberpunk aesthetics inspired by anime like Neon Genesis Evangelion and Ghost in the Shell. Its narrative is a whole other beast, a cerebral journey that twists your brain into questioning what events take place in what time, and what they could possibly have to do with what's happening in regular gameplay. The plot is as much of a puzzle as any other part of your exploration, and it's just as fascinating and engrossing. It's no wonder it draws comparisons to stuff like Twin Peaks or 2001: A Space Odyssey. The game's soundtrack, composed by Cicada Sirens and 1000 Eyes, boasts a variety of gloomy, unnerving tracks befitting of the game's setting. Droning strings, bleak piano notes, deep bass, and some downright oppressive and violent industrial sounds all come together to boost an already incredible atmosphere. And then, of course, there's the gameplay itself. It's one thing for Signalis to simply be a great visual feast and great narrative, but it's another thing for it to also be a perfectly designed survival horror game. It features a large and open map filled with corridors and rooms that lead to crucial progress or helpful resources. Inventory management is strict and requires players to really stop and think about what's important to bring with them for whatever goal it is they wish to accomplish and what isn't. Whether it's seek the next step in the alluring story, or simply try to clear nearby areas of vicious enemies that can revive after a certain amount of time. The map's complex layout is also bolstered by frequent puzzles that also require some ingenuity on the player's part to solve. Some are easy and can be cleared in a few moments, but others are multi-part challenges that can put your memory or problem-solving skills to the test. Combat is very old-fashioned, but in a good way. The main character you play as, Elster, isn't some high-flying, death-defying action cyborg, but just another potential victim in a dangerous setting that's out to kill her. Every enemy poses a threat, and being caught off guard by even the most mundane foe can be lethal. Signalis is a somber, mind-bending masterpiece of sci-fi and survival horror. It's creative, complex, beautiful to look at and listen to, and fun. And it was created by a team of only 2 people. In the relatively short time the game has been out, it's already garnered an incredible amount of praise, to the point where I've already started seeing people complain about how often they hear about the game. Well, too fucking bad. Because it deserves to be spoken about as often as it is. You hear about it all the time because it's an excellent game, and I would be remiss if I didn't say it deserves to be talked about even more. If you have any love for science fiction, horror, or just a tight, lean gameplay experience, then do yourself a favor and check out Signalis. Number 3. Pentiment. Developed by Obsidian, Pentiment tells the tale of Andreas Mahler, a journeyman artist who is temporarily staying in a small Bavarian town of Tassing, where he is fulfilling an apprenticeship at their abbey as an illuminator. During his stay, a baron by the name of Lorenz Rothvogel is murdered inside the abbey, and an elderly monk and friend of Andreas named Piero is accused of the crime. Andreas takes it upon himself to investigate the murder in hopes of freeing Piero from likely execution. 16th century Bavaria is not a time or place heavily explored by media in general, and especially not American-made media. But as you might expect, it was a time of dominant presence for Christianity, and historical figures are referenced frequently as well, including St. Augustine, Peter Abelard, William of Ockham, and Thomas Aquinas. And on top of all that, there's semi-frequent discussion of current events happening in the surrounding areas. Pentiment achieves an incredible level of detail with its setting that only someone who has done years of research can accomplish. A gargantuan aspect of Pentiment's identity is very clearly its art design, adopting the visual style of the aforementioned illuminated manuscripts. Art director Hannah Kennedy and the art team really knocked it out of the park. The characters are designed with a hand-drawn style that is heavily comparable to illuminated illustrations, and their animations are very much like paper cutouts, which is obviously very fitting. And despite the huge cast of characters, no one suffers from an unfortunate case of same face. But one trait of the game's art direction that truly bridges the gap between aesthetic and actual gameplay is the dialogue boxes. A very fascinating narrative device that I don't think I've ever seen before is how Pentiment displays a character's level of education or position in society by using different typefaces for their dialogue. Peasants and farmers have a typeface that's a little bit messy, but still legible. Nobles and educated folk have a fancier font with long strokes in the lettering, and religious members and leaders of the abbey have a black letter script so fancy that, for some, may even be a bit challenging to read at times. But the game doesn't just use it to distinguish members of society, it also uses the typefaces to give imagery to Andreas's altering perceptions of the citizens of Tassing. Ultimately, when playing a dialogue-focused adventure game with role-playing elements, it's the gameplay that has to turn the strong and passion-filled script into a memorable interactive experience. And the best way to do that is choices and consequences. You are constantly deciding on what Andreas gets to say, to the point where he is more like you than you are like him. But of course, every time a game comes out that highlights its dialogue choices, the big elephant in the room appears. The question of, what do these choices actually affect? Lackluster or borderline non-existent consequences or rewards for dialogue choices can put a real damper on a game's experience. But the game sidesteps this issue in a couple of ways. It's possible to choose several of many different background traits for Andreas, such as previous countries he's visited, which led to him to be able to speak and read their languages, and a couple areas of study he experienced in his years at university, such as oratory, the occult, or medicine. Different combinations of backgrounds and studies can lead to pretty different playthroughs, because no matter what you choose, the game gives ample opportunity for you to use them, for better and for worse. In the best case, when a dialogue choice related to a background pops up, it can slingshot you to the most positive outcome of the conversation. However, not all opportunities to use a background are beneficial. Sometimes they hurt your conversation by making Andreas seem annoying, obnoxious, or like a know-it-all. Then there's Pentiment's very deep iteration of speech checks. It involves an invisible point system where specific dialogue choices with specific characters contribute to your chances for success in the upcoming big speech check that could lead to the discovery of a huge revelation. Every once in a while, you'll make a decision in conversation that leads to a pop-up saying that your choice will be remembered. And every time this happens, it means that you've affected the outcome of a future speech check. But you don't know if your choice affects it positively or negatively until the speech check arrives. And when it does, it tallies up all the points you gained or lost in those remembered dialogue choices, and if you have enough, you succeed. If you don't, you fail. I really like this system because it puts a hefty amount of additional weight onto several other related conversations instead of just one, with some wiggle room. Pentiment is a murder mystery first and foremost, so you can't get too distracted from smaller activities. Eventually, you have to accuse someone in Tassing of committing the crime, and this is another spot where Pentiment feels truly fleshed out. Depending on the people you talk to, the activities you partake in, or the gut feelings you give into, you can collect any amount of evidence pointing at several different people. The game doesn't railroad you towards one suspect or the other. It is entirely up to you to pick someone and focus on them. And it's up to you to actually collect enough evidence to confidently and fully accuse them. If you continually make bad dialogue choices and fail speech checks and let yourself spread your time thin, you might end up with a lackluster amount of evidence for multiple suspects instead of a robust amount for a single individual. But if you spend your time wisely and reach the best outcomes for every conversation, you'll have a mountain of evidence to throw around. It all depends on you. Pentiment is a truly special little adventure RPG with a dialogue focus. It illuminates the high standard of quality that can be achieved with one cohesive vision that unites passionate and genuinely enthusiastic writing with eye-catching art direction and consequential player decisions that push people to go through the game multiple times. It's a labor of love, and it shows. If you have any interest in smaller games made with sincere fascination for its subject, give Pentiment a shot. Number 2. Vampire Survivors. Developed and maintained by one man, known by his online handle, Pongle, Vampire Survivors is a casual gothic horror shoot-'em-up with roguelite elements. It's one of the few games to truly find the ultimate sweet spot between simplicity and addictiveness. Yes, there are a ton of variables that make the game the cohesive experience that it is, but that doesn't mean it's difficult to jump in. When you open up the game for the first time, you only have a few characters to choose from and one stage to play in. So how you start is already quite simple. Progression in this game is actually quite linear. The more you play, the more you unlock additional weapons, accessories, characters, and even gameplay mechanics. You're not overwhelmed from the get-go by a bunch of unexplained systems. You have a very clear beginning point, and by the time you understand the basics of the gameplay and how most, or all, of your starting tools work, that's when the game starts to give you more. And you combine your already obtained knowledge with new knowledge you're about to acquire by using new weapons and characters for the first time to see how they work together. When you jump into the action for the first time, you might be surprised to find that you don't attack on your own. The game does it for you automatically. This is another reason as to why the game's simplicity is so effective. It might seem like a design decision that could make the game too easy, but it soon becomes clear that it was made around the fact. With weapons that attack on their own, many of them either aim in certain directions, aimed at the closest enemies, or aim randomly. Others simply stay around your character as a defensive barrier, or they might just clear the screen entirely. Proper kiting and positioning becomes increasingly important as the level progresses and the enemies become stronger and manage to tank more hits. Then there's the build variety, and it's a big contributor to the addictiveness aspect of the Vampire Survivors experience. It features the perfect amount of roguelite elements to make experimentation worth trying. The sheer volume of resources and tools you can unlock is astounding, and they all have their own unique traits, strengths, and purposes, and allow you to mix and match almost any combination and make it to the end of the 30-minute gauntlet. It's easy to commit to a run when every piece of equipment you get is useful. Not every weapon is strong right out the gate, but if you combine even the seemingly worst weapons with the right accessories to bump up its area of effect, attack duration, projectile speed, and raw power, then even a pea shooter can become a nuke. You become the final boss of a bullet hell made by Cave or something. Whether you want to wing it entirely or focus on a specific set of gear, this game ensures that any build is viable, and this is important to minimizing the feeling that your time is being wasted. And then there's the rewards. This is another thing the game offers in spades, and at different levels of commitment. It's why playing the game has been likened to receiving a straight shot of dopamine. One thing that our primitive brains truly enjoy when playing video games is immediate and visual representation of progress. The simplest and fastest way that this progress is conveyed in almost any game similar to this one is number go up. I know it sounds almost demeaning, but it's true. What better way to inform the player that they're kicking ass than to give them many ways to visually confirm it on a moment-to-moment basis? Every time you kill an enemy or grab a gem, your experience meter goes up. When you level up and gain a new weapon or improve an existing one, you deal greater damage. When you get a new accessory or power-up, your stats increase. When you open a chest, you get a ton of gold. And this visual progress isn't limited to just numbers. It includes the eye-popping amount of visual effects happening on screen. Once you near the end of your 30-minute run, you're blowing up enemies on every inch of your monitor in a colorful and satisfying display of sensory chaos. Particles are flashing everywhere and a bunch of sounds are going off to convey how much of an unstoppable badass you've become in the last half hour. And it feels good. It all feels good. Vampire Survivors is the modern-day pinnacle of simplicity meets addictiveness. It's a game that's not intimidating to jump into, it's not complicated to learn, it has easy controls, there's a seemingly countless number of weapon and power-up loadout combinations to utilize with no need for preparation, and the game is extremely generous with how it rewards you, both visually in the heat of combat and in the long term with unlockable content. It doesn't waste your time, and you can feel fulfilled even if you're playing for just 15 minutes. And on top of that, the game is a meager $4 on Steam, has no microtransactions, and can run on the simplest of machines. So it even has accessibility on its side too. In a world where AAA titles take up all the marketing space and a huge portion of online discourse, it's nice to receive a game like this. A small experience made by a small or single-person team that's easy to pick up and hard to put down. If you're the type of person who values hours played per dollar spent, then very few games come remotely close to touching what Vampire Survivors offers. Number 1. Elden Ring. Wow, what a surprise. Who could have possibly seen this coming? I truly can't say anything about Elden Ring that I, or others, haven't already said, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. The game first revealed itself to the world at E3 2019, featuring little to no details about its setting and no gameplay to speak of, but it had From Software's name attached to it, as well as Hidetaka Miyazaki's and George R.R. Martin's, the creator of A Song of Ice and Fire, who was tasked with writing the world's lore. The CG trailer sent people into a tailspin of hype. It showed almost nothing of substance, admittedly, but From Software had such an incredible track record of quality that everyone was ready and willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Sadly, a worldwide pandemic eventually struck and we heard nothing of the game, at all, for 2 full years. When it was then re-announced with a release date that was shockingly close, and more details than ever were beginning to come out. The most fascinating of all being the simple fact that the game was open world. A true open world, as opposed to the Metroidvania-style interconnected stages that every game under the Soulsborne banner had abided by. Elden Ring's setting, the lands between, looks and feels more fantastical than any other FromSoft project that came prior, and its mystical atmosphere and design evokes a sense of wonderment that few other games, RPG or otherwise, have managed to touch. Environments range from gorgeous and comforting, to bleak and moody, to confounding and otherworldly, and every other type of aesthetic and feeling in between. The world truly feels fully realized when you gaze toward the horizon and see awe-striking landmarks that are probably several in-game kilometers away. It's a level of fantasy majesty that immerses the player immediately upon entering the open world proper. It's a well thought out and carefully crafted setting with incredible detail and personality. In regard to combat, Elden Ring sports a fantastic level of pacing in fights that truly feels like it allows the player to assess the situation and respond appropriately with whatever method they choose. and there is an incredible number of tools and resources at your disposal. One is the strength of status effects. In a lot of RPGs, status effects are usually things that only the player has to worry about, because they're meant to pose an extra threat to you instead of being a tool you can rely on for your own usage. They're a one-way mechanic in that manner. It's pretty rare for an RPG to allow status effects to destroy enemies and bosses as easily as they destroy the player, but Elden Ring's clear intention of teaching combat pragmatism makes it one of those games. Then we can couple that with the effectiveness of Ashes of War, which look significantly more flashy and epic than weapon arts in Dark Souls 3, and feel that way too, even if they might not be in actual utility. Many of them allow for huge sweeping arcs or radial AoEs to deal with multiple enemies. They're fun to incorporate into fights, and it's totally viable to center an entire build around them because effective usage can decimate stronger enemies. But arguably even more effective than afflicting your foes with illness or hitting them with big Ashes of War skills is summons. And no, I'm not talking about fellow players you summon via summon signs for jolly cooperation. I'm talking about Ashes, a brand new mechanic that allows you to summon NPCs at absolutely any time you are in proximity to a rebirth monument, which are present all around the open world, in dungeons, and in the vast majority of boss fights. NPC summons range from regular trash mobs like imps, archers, and wolves to extremely powerful named warriors like Ludel the Headless, Banished Knight Oleg, and Omen Killer Rollo. What's more is that these summons are upgradable, meaning you can talk to a specific NPC to make them more powerful and last longer in battle. The best summons in the game can last entire endgame boss fights once fully upgraded, and in some cases can defeat the boss on their own. It is incredible. As a part of combat, there's also the arsenal, weapons and spells, and there's quite an impressive selection. Over 300 weapons spread across 31 weapon types, including but not limited to straight swords, great swords, colossal weapons, axes, bows, crossbows, claws, fists, flails, daggers, katanas, and even torches. Yes, torches. There's multiple types of torches in this game. The catalog of weaponry at your disposal is gargantuan, with their own strengths and perks. There's common weapons that you can find pretty much anywhere or simply purchase from a merchant for cheap. And there's unique weapons that boast their own equally unique Ashes of War, and a lot of them feel very, very viable, especially with clever infusing. Going into spells, there's a bit worth touching on here as well. Elden Ring retains the existence of the FP meter, which debuted in Demon's Souls but disappeared until it came back in Dark Souls 3. Obviously, not all spells are at the same level of usefulness and utility. Some are pretty decent, some are worthless, and some are just plain incredible, assuming you can freely spend the FP. Much like Ashes of War, the best spells look and feel epic, like you're truly playing the main character in a fantasy setting, ranging anywhere from simple, single shots that do a meager amount of damage to summoning forth cataclysmic meteors that can obliterate groups of trash mobs, to healing and buffing spells for yourself and your allies. There's a spell for every situation and at every level of commitment to being a caster, making it easy to keep some good offensive spells even if you're mostly melee focused and with a small investment in magic. There's also awesome dragon spells that temporarily transform your character into a dragon to spew magic breath, fire breath, or rot breath to inflict big damage and status effects. The magical arsenal of Elden Ring is extensive, as it is superb. They are flashy, they hit hard, and above all else, they're fun to use. And finally, there's the vast, incredible open world of the lands between. Elden Ring represents what can only be considered the new pinnacle of open world design. Dreams of an open world Souls game have been active since development of Dark Souls 2, which aimed to implement the feature, but a smorgasbord of developmental issues kept the dream as exactly that. It wasn't until now that FromSoft was able to give it another earnest shot, with Miyazaki and Tanimura co-directing, and the result is this jaw-dropping universe that is more than the sum of its parts. Too many open worlds seem like they're incapable of sparking the flame of discovery inside the player's own mind, without having a big arrow at the top of the screen constantly pointing them at the next objective, or an NPC telling them how important it is to do something, or the player character themselves constantly remarking out loud that they should go and check this nearby thing out. Even if that game's open world really is fascinating, all of these things feel like a crutch that the game has to rely on to ensure the map the developers worked so hard on is actually scoured. Elden Ring has none of these weaknesses. The Lands Between is equal parts intriguing, beautiful, and mysterious. FromSoft does not need to constantly pester the player with reminders to look in a certain direction, or check out a nearby cave, or finish an objective they've been ignoring for hours. This isn't incompetence on their part, it's a bet that they can make a world that's naturally engrossing and can drive the player to set out on an adventure for themselves without using any of the common UI systems, elements, and mechanics that other games rely on. And it's a bet they won. Getting lost amidst the countless wonders of the Lands Between is easy, and that's a good thing. None of it is just worthless distractions. The game doesn't just motivate you to go out there and explore, it also constantly rewards you for doing so. Every dungeon you clear, every optional boss you defeat, every merchant you find and talk to, every ruin you discover, you're given something that looks important, even if it might not fit with your current build. A weapon, a talisman, an ash of war, a rare crafting or upgrade material, or even a key item in a side quest you haven't even started yet. Elden Ring gives you all the right reasons to get your ass on your horse and start investigating, and it's fun the entire time. You don't need to sit and convince yourself to go somewhere because you're not sure it'll be worth it. You already know it will be. Elden Ring is FromSoft's new masterpiece. It looks back on all, or almost all, of the rights and wrongs from previous Souls games and combines the lessons learned into what is the most epic experience they've made so far. And on an unprecedented scale that any studio who is even slightly less talented would clumsily trip and fall over. It's an impressive, powerful amalgam of the best aspects of all its predecessors. It boasts a gorgeous world that effortlessly drives you to explore for the sake of it. It features combat that we know and love while adding cool new mechanics that are fun to use. It has characters and lore that are enigmatic and enthralling. It has beautiful music and art direction. And it's simply one of the most satisfying gaming experiences released in the last 10 years or so. With the exception of very special circumstances, I cannot imagine myself bothering to ever go back to past Souls titles after experiencing Elden Ring. Yes, they do have their own unique aspects that continue to make them special and distinct from one another, but Elden Ring is just the ideal all-rounder. It scratches almost every conceivable itch that every one of its predecessors does, but with the added bonus of reaching those tricky spots that they haven't. While I do not dislike them overall, I was slightly stung by the needle of disappointment with Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 in respect to their gameplay, and I was prepared for the chance of feeling it again. But Elden Ring turned it all around with such resounding success, I almost feel foolish for ever having doubts in Miyazaki and Tanimura's leadership to begin with. I have no doubt in my mind, Elden Ring will secure its spot in history as one of the greatest games of all time. And that's everything. My honorable mentions and my top 5. I know some people will immediately be struck with the desire to ask, where's blank? But the simplest and most likely answer is, I likely didn't play it. And in the off chance I did, I just didn't like it as much as the other games mentioned in this video. But like I said at the beginning, I'm just one guy running this one channel, and that's on top of already having a full-time job. I have the income to buy a ton of games, but not the time to play anywhere close to all of them, so I have to carefully pick and choose my experiences. Moving forward, there's a ton to look forward to throughout the rest of 2023. I've already reviewed a couple games, and the hype train is still going full speed for several others. Depending on when this video goes up, I'm either close to getting my hands on Resident Evil 4 Remake, or already in the middle of enjoying it. After that, I'm anticipating Street Fighter 6, definitely Final Fantasy 16, and other games scattered around the remainder of the year, including Starfield, Armored Core 6, Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, maybe Final Fantasy VII Rebirth if it's not an early 2024 release instead, the return of Forza Motorsport, Like a Dragon Gaiden, Spider-Man 2, Pragmata, Remnant 2, Stalker 2, Stellar Blade, Warhammer 40,000 Bolt Gun, and Space Marine 2, the list just goes on and on. 2023 is looking to be one hell of a year. Such a massive one, maybe it'll end up with a top 10 instead. We'll just have to wait and see. This concludes my top 5 games of 2022. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.